Oh, good morning, or actually, yeah, good afternoon here. I didn't realize I was still muted.
No worries. All right. Well, I got about 10 o'clock, so I think we can get rolling here. Um, Good morning and or afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's KAMIND webinar, Document Sensitivity, Protecting Your Documents. My name's Mike Klass, and I'm an account manager here at KAMIND IT. Before we get rolling today, a couple housekeeping items. There will be time for Q&A at the end, so if you could keep your microphone on mute during the presentation, that would be excellent. With many of us working from home, we'd like to eliminate all background distraction noises. If you have a question mid-presentation, please feel free to use the chat functionality or the raise hand icon, and we'll be sure to weave your question into the presentation best we can. We will be recording today's webinar, so if you're uncomfortable with this, now would be your opportunity to opt out. Now, with that out of the way, let's get down to business. This webinar is about Microsoft's rebranded product family, now called Purview. Compliance and data governance are really the main drivers behind Purview. Not all data has equal value. Some documents need more protection than others. You may have PII, PHI, PCI, and many other types of data to protect. So how do you classify, manage, and monitor your documents wherever they live, even in multiple vendors like AWS, Box, Dropbox, and others cloud solutions? Please sit back and relax, and let's hear our President and CEO, Mr. Matt Katzer, talk to us today about document sensitivity, how to protect your documents. Please take it away, Matt.
Hey, thanks, Mike, and welcome everyone. Yeah, document sensitivity, this is a very interesting topic, especially look at what's happening in terms of, the environment and the amount of information that we're actually collecting. But so we'll get more into that a little bit. But yeah, it's going to be kind of fun. I have some examples and some good tests, what happens when you put document sensitivity in place and some ideas on how the best way to actually move forward. A little bit about KAMIND for those who don't know us. We're basically an Inc. 5000 company, 5th year running. We're also a CMC CCP. We're one of the 500 people that have actually gone through the certification test. And also, one of the big things that we've done is we're everything about 365, and we sold over 280,000 copies of how to get people on board to the 365. So, and when you look in terms of the pieces, my latest book, for instance, was Securing Office 365, because you look in terms of what our philosophy is, and it always has been, if you get the security right in the organization, then you drive down the total IT cost. And especially, and that's a good segue into it, because security at this time has never been more critical than ever before. Because if you look in terms of what's going on, especially like with AI and everything else, the amount of password attacks that you're actually getting, the median time for the attacker to basically be able to get into your personal information, your private data. And also on top of this, you look at the number of skilled workers that we're missing in the security field. It's just an extremely challenging time for businesses, as the good guys and the bad guys are staffing up with AI and the good guys are staffing up AI. It's really kind of fascinating what's going on. But what's really has happened, this whole environment has gotten nothing more but more and more complex. And if you look in just the different pieces of what you actually have to access on, it's just crazy. And if you look specifically in terms of what Microsoft stack on, and we're going to go we're just a real quick through it, it's the amount of information that Microsoft's protecting, how many threats that they analyze, how many things get blocked. Can you imagine dealing with 65 trillion threats signals every day going into your enterprise? That's the type of thing. So us as a community, we actually have to look at how this all works together and how we actually protect things, because it's not just how we actually do things, it's how we're protecting data to make sure that we really manage it correctly. And it's when you look in terms of a security stack, for instance, it's a couple of different things. It's data, it's about the user identity, It's what you have in the cloud, email, what apps you're using, what endpoint strategy, and it's all has to be integrated. There's a very complex and comprehensive model that you have to deal with. And when you talk about document sensitivity, one of the things we look at in enterprises, we have to really understand the pieces of what we want to know and how do we actually protect that and govern that sensitive data. Now, previously, like a month ago, in our webinars actually recorded, we went through the entire Microsoft security stack. Today, we're going to talk one specific point of it, and that's basically we're going to talk about the Microsoft Purview. And when you talk about Purview, we're talking about basically what's the security hardening and the things that we need to actually do in the environment to basically protect data. But the real issue for us, when you talk about Purview, when you talk about data governance, and you talk about how to handle the environment, it's really trying to understand what we have and really trying to understand what is in our enterprise. What data is easily discoverable, what data do we need to protect, and how do we prevent accidental sharing. And this is more important as we go through with the AI being deployed, like Copilot, for instance, is going to be readily available starting on November 1st. You're also seeing in terms of Bing Chat Enterprise, which is a chat GPT that gives you a protected chat, and that's already available now, and we're using it rapidly, and it's basically scaling the organization like crazy. But all this stuff and all the new technologies, everything looks at data. And data is really the key when you look at the pieces of what we have to do and how much information is just we have to cover. They, predict IDC suspect that there's going to be 175 zettabytes by 2025. Just think of it. When you think of like you have zettabytes, you have petabytes, you have gigabytes, you start seeing the scale of data that we have that's actually put in place. You can't imagine it. And how do you actually manage the data? Because the whole thing about it is how you have to protect information. And what's going on in terms of the environment, if you're not managing information or you're not protecting your information, you're going to end up with what we call a business termination event, which means that the amount of fines associated, like give me an example, for instance, there was it was a healthcare company, 250 people. They deployed MFA, except 2 doctors didn't want to deploy it, so they didn't use it. And they ended up having a data breach. And the data breach, they had 40,000 records that were PHI that was actually distributed in the wild. Now, the cost of cleaning up a record runs roughly about $1,200 to $2,000 a record. So when you actually look at it, is that, and they had insurance and cyber insurance and everything else, and so they had 40,000 records times $2,000 per record. So when you start looking at the amount of money that they actually have to go fork off in terms of the $8 to $10 million that they have to actually clean up the environment, they have cyber insurance. Well, what happened is the cyber insurance folks came through and looked at it and said, okay, who's using MFA? Who's using not MFA? Well, 2 doctors weren't using MFA. Therefore, the cyber insurance looked at their policy. They said 100% usage of it. And they basically said, okay, guess what? We're not covering it. And the business went out of business. That's the type of things that you actually have to deal with. You get these environments where basically if you don't manage the data and you don't put the right governance challenges in place, you end up in a situation where you can actually have a business termination event. So you got to be very proactive, you got to monitor incidents, and you got to react in terms of find out what happens. You have to build that into your model and basically deal. And that's what document sensitivity is about. And you want to really take the approach about a mitigation approach with a data governance report. So you basically want to look at things, how to actually respond, be proactive in what you have, and basically be reactive to it. And that's kind of the key. And you look at everything that goes through, it really comes down to really 4 simple things. You have to know your data. And you're going to have to basically, you got to know. So as an organization, I got to know what type of data I'm collecting, what type of data I have in the environment. I have to actually know that I basically need to put the right governance in place. And I have to put the necessary data loss protection. So it's really trying to understand all the pieces because you need to put the structure in place to really grow and understand where that data is. Where do I have PHI? Where do I have PII? What about trade secrets in the organization? How do I actually have vision data live? Now, in terms of compliance, you do in terms of like, in terms of CMMC, for instance, that's a cybersecurity maturity model certification requirements that the DoD have. They have an element known as specified CUI. That's controlled unclassified information. So even that, you have to basically use document sensitivity to basically know where the data is. And then once you actually know where the data is, then you can put the necessary controls in place to protect it. That's what we talk about in terms of sensitivity type. When we talk about really document sensitivity, is coming through and saying, hey, you want to put sensitivity types so we know what they are, and we want to put labels on it and put a structure in place that we can actually go manage the whole environment. And then the next step is that you want to prevent data loss. So you leverage those sensitivity labels and you basically put a structure in place to make sure that you have the necessary control information so you don't have data leakage in the organizations. And then you just govern it in terms of how you actually want to handle it. Now, governing means certain things like how long do you retain data? How long do you keep it? How long do you basically get rid of it? How do you actually depose it? You have to manage everything. That's the changes that going on today. So when you get the whole piece of it, you have to basically comes right down to these four things. You just got to get in this monitoring mode of understanding who has access to what. And especially when we look at in terms of Copilot being released in terms of that's the AI to assist the users in finding information, you really need to put the controls in place. And that's what we're talking about, document sensitivity and labeling. And that's really crucial. And that's whole pieces of it is giving that model to where you basically have a platform that you can look at information, you know what it is, and you can take the appropriate steps. Because it's about, as all of us, as we look in businesses, we are the custodians for our business. We have to basically manage the information associated into it. And we want to try to make sure that it's really controlled. And it's really important when you start really internalizing the amount of data that you actually have in an environment. Like here's a diagram, for instance, is that you look at the different pieces. You have people in chatting, you have basically, company information, IP, you have revenue plans, you have, trade secrets that you have, phone numbers, different types of data, address information. There's different user data that you actually have. So now you start looking from a business standpoint, saying that, okay, I want to make sure my business is being managed, and what you actually do about it is it's about how you actually look at it and you manage risk. And all those areas where you actually have data, you have potential risks. And risk to a business is exposure, you're violating regulations, violating state and local and federal laws, and you end up in a situation where basically it's not a good place to be because you haven't managed your data estate. And that's a whole concept of when you look at purview and document labeling. And the approach that we always take, and we take this with a lot of different things, it's really about a defense in depth strategy. You want to prevent loss, that's why we have DLP. You want to manage risk because risk is saying, okay, how much the business is willing to risk the livelihood of the business and protect data. How do you protect it? How do you discover data? And how do you actually manage it? So it's a comprehensive model when you talk about labeling and document sensitivity. And the key part of that is you have to basically start developing a data map. Now, in the CMC space, we have a term that we call data flow. And so in essence, when you have control on classified information or CUI, you basically start building a data flow where that is so you know what you have to actually manage. In the commercial space, this is PHI. You have to understand where PHI is in the organization and where your trade secrets are and be able to manage it because you want to basically protect the information, put the necessary data loss prevention policies in place, and you want to manage risk. And that's really the comprehensive approach that you actually take. And to do it, you really need a unified data classification with labels and policies. And that's where Purview comes in because basically it has a built-in policy structure So like in the diagram here, you can actually go through and define documents in terms of type. The users can actually do that. You can label things on the fly. Now, from a management standpoint, you actually see the visibility of the different type of documents in your organization. So you actually be able to explore and see the different type of classifications and build it so you know what the risk is. So as an IT administrator, you don't have the ability or the time to go through the entire organization and type everything. You have to get the community, your organization, to actually work and try and put policies in place to make sure things get labeled correctly, make sure things get defined. And there's a lot of activity in terms of how you do this, and I'll walk through some of them in a few minutes. But it gives you an idea to make it's a much more simplified approach. There still is work associated with it. And with also you end up looking at, once you get data, you actually have to go look in terms of more information, a deeper underline of what you actually have. So you get an underlying view of it. And then you have to basically look at what's being used. So all these pieces are discovery data, be able to explore what you have, be able to look in terms of what the activity and who's using what, because you have situations where you have different types of data and different types of people in the organization. Some people are not supposed to have access to certain types of data. So you need to be aware of that and what people are doing to actually manage it. And then when you look in terms of purview, for instance, and the key aspect of that is this whole idea of sensitive info types in terms of what type of documents that you actually have, and coming up with a label model that defines it. Now, in the cases of certain types of document, for instance, is you run in for CUI, for instance, which is there's not a unique numbering scheme of CUI that's controlled unclassified information. In that case, what happens is you have that information in known location, so you start managing it from a location standpoint, and then you tag different documents in terms of labels that the type of document is, so you can apply the necessary automated tools. And that's really the secret of it. And they use the other parts of the old Microsoft Rights Management to manage the services. You look in terms of how there's DLP endpoint and 365 in terms of who has access to it, how data is actually distributed, and how it's actually managed it. So how do you, and different types of approaches that you use with Purview in terms of how do you actually keep protected data from different parts of the cloud? How do you manage the on-premise environment? And how do you basically manage different environments and be able to cross-pollinate it? And that's the pieces that you actually have on different types of things that you want to do. And you get this whole concept of trying to build an integrated model. And so you get this whole issues of basically trying to look at these different things that you're trying to put together in terms of different sensitivity information, for instance, how to do exact data match, where locations based on, and there's context-based classifications, which is going to be released fairly soon. But all these information is how you actually label and actually handle data, do sensitivity control. And that gives you this whole piece of it to basically understand and govern the data in your environment, safeguard the data where it is, and basically improve the risk through DLP controls to basically make sure you kind of reduce the exposure of the business that you actually have. And that whole piece in terms of what it is, and you do add different types of terms of identity management, for instance, you have different types of controls to put in place. But it's a really complex environment. And it really comes down to what we're talking about today is really these two pieces of it. Understand and govern the data and be able to safeguard the data where it lives. And all that comes down to is really putting labels. And labels are basically content labels that you could put in place. There's also labels into containers like SharePoint sites and teams and channels and groups. So you can do massive type structuring from that aspect. You can also do different types of labels and apply them where they need, so the users are much more friendly. Now, Microsoft has some sensitivity types, they've kind of the standard ones that they bring out there, but there's also very specific stuff that you can actually do. So you can actually make sure like different types of, sensitive information types, such as CUI or other types, top secret and trades. You can define things and do information as well. But one of the key things with the document sensitivity labeling model is you have to go through a policy simulation model, because when you're putting labels in place, and this is what a lot of people forget, and we all made this mistake, is that we having a great idea, we know that everything's going to be 100% right, but we don't go through and simulate it to see what it is to kind of figure out the policies and the problems. That's really the secret of what you want to do. So it's really defining the policy, defining how you want to govern the data, and simulate what the impact is, and then go rolled out the labeling model. And then it's basically, you can do this on scale. And you structure the stuff that labels can be applied by default for certain types of documents. You can apply them automatically in organization, and you can actually go drive it to what's important, what you're trying to accomplish in the business. And that's really the pieces. And like, one thing, for instance, is like, you have like the PDF files, for instance. Those are kind of the most important. So you can actually go through in terms of putting the necessary copy control. Like right now, we have this one that's confidential. So this document basically doesn't allow this, basically a document to be to copied. So you have in areas you can actually go through, and you actually take and have documents rendered in SharePoint as well, and put necessary controls on it. So you can automatically label documents and put the necessary pieces on it. So only those people who have the right to know can actually look at it. And you can actually go through and you can auto label documents as a put in different places. Someone receives an order from a customer, and it's different type of, there's proprietary information on it. By act of saving that order into a SharePoint site that has the necessary label, you are actually labeling that document automatically. So you build it into folks' workflow. And that's really the key thing. And the other aspect that you're actually seeing in terms of documents, like in this case, like PDFs from Adobe, they actually supporting in terms of the sensitivity label. And you're seeing this with a lot of third party, because and Purview is actually extendable to third party for different types of document management. But the question that everybody always asks us is the same one. How do you get started? Now, that's always a challenge, and it's not as difficult as you see, because earlier we talked about, you can basically define labels in containers. You can define labels as default. The real strategy for us to get started is a very simple one. You got to come up with what your label model is supposed to be. What in terms of structure and the priority and who has access. And then you publish the labels to the end users, because what you want to do is embrace your community, embrace your team, embrace your company to start manually labeling documents. And there's different strategies folks have. They have a document labeling party, they give awards and everything else. But the goal is you have to start somewhere. Whatever works makes sense. You just basically want to start building a label model so it's into someone's workflow. So any document that you can actually put is going to have a certain label on it. And by definition, that label may be in your organization that you can't send it externally until it's changed to a different label type. And you have different, and depending what the organization scales, you can have different types of labels. You can automate and deploy these as well, because it's all achievable through an API. And the whole thing is about trying to figure out what their policies is. So you can basically look at it. It's easy to turn the policies on and give you that one-click view of basically auto labeling. So the key thing is define what you want to do, and then you're going to start with labeling, and then basically start educating the organization. Like in this case, we're saying, like, here's a Word document, for instance, where there's a sensitivity classification, and I can actually have a confidential, I have sub labels that I can associate with it. So I can actually label different documents at how I'm actually doing today. I can do this in Word, I can do it in Excel, I can do it in PowerPoint, because you're training the organization to start doing things to basically put the labeling in place. And then also you can actually do the same thing with people, the same stuff into like OneDrive or SharePoint. You can label all the files in OneDrive and SharePoint. Now, remember when we talk about labeling, we're talking about basically putting document sensitivity so we can use these other tools like DLP to control information flow, to control shrinkage in the organization. And you want to look at pieces like that in terms of how to actually roll it through. And you can also do this in terms of saying copies, for instance, as a PDF documents. You can do different types of things. Now, how you actually do that is actually very straightforward. You can actually come up with a sensitivity label in Purview, and you go through, and there's a wizard that walks you through the steps in terms of labeling, so you can label the assets. And if you're looking at from, also you can look in terms of, you can apply what type of labels you want to have. In this case, we're using more of the generic, but you can actually use templates of a customization for your organization. For instance, I worked at Intel. Intel has a labeling classification system where they would have red cover documents, orange cover documents, green and blue, different types of documents have different types of access codes. These are the things that follow through. So you look at what your organization's doing, you just manage it from that standpoint. Now, the other piece to look at in terms of other types of labeling is just really trying to simulate how it fits. So you, as you come up with a labeling model, go simulate how it is, what's going to be the reaction of it, and basically helps you to basically make sure you have, when you do auto labeling, you don't break anything, because we as IT administrators, we don't want to break anything. Trust me, because I come from the school of thought, you break it, you fix it. As a service provider, we're very much cognizant of making sure that stuff works the way it's supposed to, and we implement it the way it's supposed to. And that's really the key, that you look at all these type of things that you put in place. And you can actually do different types of filters, and you can match policies before you assign labels. There's different types of capabilities that you actually have in terms of what our Purview do. But once you have configured the simulation policies, then you basically start deploying them. And then you start deploying in terms of the auto labeling policies. So you start putting the necessary policies in place. Now, what that really means is that when you're looking at content, you're now seeing, you can actually go through, look, and this is SharePoint, you can actually see the sensitivity of the documents as well. So you now have visibility into what's going on once they put the labels in place. And it's very straightforward to actually go ahead and do that and make sure to get the pieces in place. And also, when the stuff is label type, you can define what type of label characteristics that you want to do. And it's just really just kind of coming down to just pick that label model that you want to use and deploy it. And you can also do in terms of build a special justification model. Now we have them tool tips or different type of capability, but you can actually have policy tips to help train your users, and you can have additional information associated with it. And so the way that works is that, from a standpoint, here's a document, for instance, is that, trying to send a email. And so you can send it anyway. So you can actually put a lot of training wheels in place to make sure that the people are educated through the process, because you're trying to make them aware that you're sending out information, and you're trying to control the information in such a way to make it simple. Now, you can actually do a simple block from this stand. You can do a more complex to say, hey, I'm the user, I'm going to accept responsibility for sending the information out. This is really up to more of your organization. How do you actually set things up or configure pieces? And you get in terms of capabilities that allows you actually to override the attachment too. And you can, like in this case, you're saying that, hey, I'm sending this document out, but it really doesn't have any sensitivity. It shouldn't be classified. So you're feeding back information to the organization. This is super important as well, because you got to be able, it's not just you here, it's everyone, and you're working as a team on the pieces. And there, you can actually go through and basically define different types of characteristics. You have all different types of things that you can actually put in place. It really comes down to, how do you want the label to apply, who has access, what business roles do they have, and who can actually do what. And it's all revolved around one thing, is basically be able to protect your data and classify it. And you want to classify it during the label types, if it's manual or automated, or if the data is in rest or in transmit. You want to extend it by other systems. You want to enable the DLP policies, and you want to make sure it persists in terms of data. And you have it's customizable. And that's really the advantage, is what you're looking at, because you're looking at the information and be able to actually control it, because you're trying to put the pieces in place so that you have a better way to actually manage what is exfiltrated or potentially exfiltrated out of the organization. And the whole aspect of that And like in this case, for instance, is this previous one, for instance, we had of, I don't know if I can't remember if I turned on my speech or not, but you can actually define labels based on the type. So in terms of what you want to try to do is you want to really build the model where you have policy tips built into the organization. You have information so you can control what's being in there. And you actually run the information so you actually basically kind of detect it, because that's really the secret. That as you look in terms of the pieces goes, you want to basically make sure that you have done the necessary simulations, the pieces in place, and you have intelligent labeling in place to make it work. So when you look at this combination of, different types of documents, like here's mobile document, Excel, and Outlook and OWA, you're basically seeing different types of labeling contexts on the documents. Over here for sensitivity, over here for the, again, sensitivity in Excel. And then you look at document sensitivity on the mobile device. All those things are in place. So once you put it in place and put the structure, it basically comes down to really just managing it. And in management comes down is simply what locations do you want this to apply? And how do you actually put the necessary data loss reviews in place of how do you want to define those? And those are what you do to basically put the various pieces in place. Now, if it's even in teams channels, because it's about data as well. So you can take an entire team and make it a label, take channels and make it labels. You have a lot of different types of capabilities to actually do. So like this case is that we have a team site, for instance, that basically is trying to access data, and the data is basically has labeling saying that you can't do it. And that's kind of important that you look at it. Like in this case, we have a situation where here's an example of you look at what's going on in an environment of handling when someone tries to copy information, and they'll get a pop-up that the data has been prevented, you can't copy the data. Those are the type of things that you're trying to put in place to make sure that's in place in your organization. So you want to have this real-time aspects of labeling that you let the systems use it to control information. In terms of trying to copy information too, you have situations where here, someone's tried to copy it to a USB drive that's plugged in. Now, a lot of folks, if you haven't blocked up USB, you probably should, but here's a case where they didn't have the USB ports blocked up and they're trying to prevent data loss. All these things in terms of what you actually have to look at and what you're trying to worry about and try to make sure that you have the necessary rules. And all this is based on data labeling. Now, if you have like an environment where you have drop boxes in the environment, or you have an environment that basically you have like Google Drive, for instance, you want to basically be able to block content from third-party storage. That's what labeling allows you to do. So you use a combination of labeling with, in terms of document sensitivity, with in terms of DLP rules that you can actually control access. And so the whole thing gets right down to this original diagram that we talked about is really come up with the document sensitivities that you want to use, come up with your labeling that you associated with them, and then necessarily let the systems in 365 put the controls in place so you govern how data is actually managed. And that's the whole secret of labeling when you get right down to it. Plan the labels out, put the process, use the controls in place to manage it. And that's how you actually get through it. But the questions we have that everyone always asks is, besides looking in terms of how to manage just that one data, is really how do you actually get started? Well, getting started is basically comes down to really a question of, are you going to manage security and compliance, or are you basically going to use a third party? And when you look in terms of managing compliance, you're trying to look in terms of the data estate. Now, this is example in terms of like KAMIND, we have a couple different programs that we have in place to do managed security. But it depends if you're in the commercial side, if it depends in GCC High. They're all different things. In GCC High, for instance, we really talking about document sensitivity with CUI. And then when you do manage security, it's trying to get the pieces in place of it to make sure you have the necessary controls for the data loss prevention. And that's where the purview comes in, because purview sits there and basically makes sure you have the environment to prevent unauthorized and accidental sharing and transfer of sensitive data. And that's where it all revolves around it. So you manage the environment to make sure that does, you don't leak data. because you want to make sure data is controlled. So, and now in terms of what Microsoft done is they released in terms of DLP for Mac OS as well. There's different environments. So if you have a heterogeneous environment, you have different types of things to put in place. So you get a whole idea of how you can actually manage it because you're using labels to characterize a document, using the DLP services to basically do the protection, use the endpoint to basically control what's happening to the documents, and basically manage that in terms of how it goes in on-premise or it goes into, on-premise environment, because you want to manage the entire infrastructure associated with it. Now, in terms of how we handle, like in terms of the Garden Fortress, for instance, we use the terms of the, NIST 800-171, which is where our security program is targeted. But that's kind of one piece. You may actually have your own security pieces and everything else, but you may also have a situation where you want to have better visibility in your environment. Now, what we've done is we released today, we have a tool called Proof of Execution tool that basically gives you that perspective of what's going on into your data estate. So you can actually go through without basically fully deploying a managed services infrastructure. You can actually go through and say, hey, let's go take a look at what we have and do an assessment. Are we losing data? Do we have the DLP rules in place? All those things pick up in terms of what this Guard Plus Proof Execution tool is. So you get some of the pieces and everything else. So it really is an environment that you look at it, you're trying to figure out how is the best way to actually manage data. And that's the secret. And document sensitivity is all about managing data. And when you look at it, that's what you're trying to accomplish on the pieces of it. Now, we have a couple different webinars coming up on the schedule. So I know we went through this very fast. It was, document sensitivity is a big topic. And I figured the best way to show you was get you an overview of the various components and pieces in it. So kind of wet your whistle in terms of what you're actually looking for. So you can see with some of the, just see some of the concept and let you think about how do you want to actually manage information in your organization. Now, coming up, we're going to have some additional webinars to talk about some things. CMC 2.1, we think it's going to be coming out around the corner, so we're scheduling a webinar in November about your IT budget in terms of how to schedule the pieces, and also about Copilot. And the big thing about Copilot is you better put a document labeling strategy in place, because that's really the key for it. So a couple call to actions for you is really, compliance. When you talk about compliance and document and sensitivity, you got to be monitoring it, you got to manage it. And the first thing you do is like what Microsoft has in terms of Purview. You can do data discovery. Do a data discovery and see what you actually have in your environment and see the pieces of it and understand what you're trying to do. And then to look in terms of understanding the pieces of security you need to put in place, looking at our Guard Plus assessment tool, because that will basically give you an idea of how to understand your data risk and what your data exposure. And if you have any other questions, give us a call David, Mike, or myself. And then also, if you're interested in more information in Guard Plus, which is the assessment tool to tell you what you actually have, go click on the link below and put a feedback, and we'll send you the white paper on it. And with Mike, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you very much, Matt. A lot of good information there. Hope you guys had your seatbelt on. A lot of information. Anyways, I was sitting there, listening to this, thinking of the good old days, like 2 years ago, when you had Azure Information Protection, Rights Management, and DLP. I used to call them the three legs of the stool. But now, with Purview, it's much more integrated. The labeling is really matured now, and they've really made life a lot easier than it used to be. And again, it's compliance that's really driving this. And we're seeing it in more and more compliance. When we looked at a few compliance roadmaps, we saw that, for next year or the year after. So anyways, just wanted to expose you guys to what's going on in the Purview world. And we'd like to open it up to any questions you might have. Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. We'd be happy to answer any questions you might have. And we also have the chat vehicle. So if you're a little shy and would like to just post a question in the chat, I'd be happy to read it out for you.
Yeah, there's one chat that came in with Jeremy. All the stats came from IDC, and they're footnoted on the slides. That the material will be posted that you can look later, but that's where the material came from. The one thing about document sensitivity is that people have a hard time trying to figure out what to get started. I mean, literally, the easiest way to do it is you come up with a set of 4 or 5 document classifications, what you do, run them through a simulator, and make a decision from a business standpoint. Do you control information? What type of information do you allow people to email out? What's going to be the default document type, the document protection that you put in place? And then the other thing that we also recommend is during when this is initially being rolled out, make sure you put a lot of policy, like I went through some of those policy screens really quickly, but put a lot of policies in place so people can actually say, hey, here's a tip on this. What do I want to do? And ask for the response and build it, because you're going to have to build this into the culture. And the problem is, if you don't do this, you risk, because the way the tightening of the insurance, we're seeing the new insurance applications come through, you're putting your business at risk because you cannot afford, right now the bad actors wants your data, and you cannot afford the cleanup necessary to basically get the records. I'm more afraid of, from a financial standpoint, we have processes to clean up for ransomware. So yeah, throw our systems away and we'll restore everything. I'm more concerned about dealing with PHI and, sensitive information, because those are very rigid, fine and structures. And, you can't protect stupidity, but you got to plan for it. So you want to put the pieces in place to make sure that you're protecting the business. And that's really the secret.
Looks like we have a question here.
Yeah. So the question posted in the chat is, despite all the tools available, labeling, it's like a huge undertaking. What aspect do you recommend for businesses don't have the technical staff to carry this out in the process of managing it and meeting government requirements? Well, that's a really good question. It really comes down to what resources you have on the staff. Do you have resources to actually implement it, or are you going to reach out to a managed security provider such as KAMIND? And we have in our program, for our security program, we have Fortress, which includes document sensitivity, which we will actually go through and develop a document sensitivity program and a rollout strategy for your organization for what you're trying to protect. I mean, the decision is that how much are you going to spend internally versus how much you're going to contract externally. When you look in terms of and the thing to really internalize, when you look at business risk now with the regulations coming down and what we need to protect and do, this is not a optional to do it anymore. This is something that you need to do. Now, Microsoft has tried to make this as simple as possible, but if you need help with it, trying to roll it out, hey, reach out to us or reach out to another service provider that can provide you with a document sensitivity. So yeah, one of the questions we have when we do different types of security products, for instance, we have Guard, and we also have Fortress and Fortress G. So in Fortress, we actually have document sensitivity is built into part of that offering. And in Fortress G, we have it designed specifically for the CMC level 2 space for CUI. And those are kind of the standard. Guard is our entry-level security product, and you add different options on it depending on what your business needs.
Great questions, Brian. Does anybody else have any other questions? Please feel free to unmute yourself or ask away in the chat. We still have a few more minutes before top of the hour, and we'd just like to get any of your questions answered. I'd also like to remind everybody that in less than 2 weeks, 2 weeks from yesterday, November 1st, Microsoft's releasing their greatly anticipated Copilot, which is the integration of AI into their application suite. That's very exciting, and I think people are really going to like that.
Yeah, I mean, we've been using Bing Chat Enterprise and waiting for the Copilot SKUs. So when the Copilot SKUs will appear, then we basically can start provisioning those. It's going to be kind of challenging to see the pieces. So even for us, we put a document strategy, very simple document strategy, what type of documents that you actually have. You know, you have public, you have confidential, internal. It's easy to do. It's easy to set up some defaults for documents. And the simulation tool works wonders at trying to get the pieces in place. But it's best thing you got to start now. And the question is that, one thing is that, do you have a consultant just hired to bring in your document conversions, or do you basically manage it, use a managed service provider services on top of it? The problem you're going to have, and this is like with any DLP process or any type of high-end security, you're going to have to manage it. We had a situation years ago where we actually were brought in to build out a security infrastructure of a client. We built out all the security infrastructure and gave them instructions of what they needed to do to go manage it. They didn't manage it. And what happened is a year or so later, they got breached. And came in to do an analysis of what happened. And they found that they weren't paying attention to the alerts and notifications. And if they paid attention to them, they wouldn't have had a problem. So they had a ransomware event. And that's the whole secret, because what happens is when you put the security infrastructure in place, things work really well. And then you take your eyes off the ball. And this is the same with document classification. And then when it gets to the point of 6 months down the road, you haven't been paying attention. So suddenly you have areas where data has been leaking. You have areas where, security issues are popping up. You have to manage it, and it has to be an active management. So it's the best way to do it is you can bring in a consultant. We've done work for folks before, but the problem is that it needs to be managed. And our best way to actually approach this is look at a managed security compliance offering that will actually manage data to make sure to take that peace of mind, because the business risk you're dealing with today is your business going to survive tomorrow if you have an event? And it's not a simple, well, something bad happened, they'll just take my data. It's more of, will the business be able to recover and survive as a functioning entity if you have an event? And 82% of the small businesses that have an event do not recover.
Excellent questions. Again, if you have any other questions, please feel free to unmute or type it into the chat. This is the third call, and we'd love to hear your questions if you have any. All right, well, I'm not seeing any more chats, and not hearing anybody speak up. So on behalf of KAMIND, I say thank you, and we appreciate you on our webinar today, and look forward to seeing you on one of our webinars in the future. Like Matt mentioned, if you're into DoD and CMMC, our next one for that would be on November 16th at 10 a.m. And again, you have our number here. Please hit the feedback form. And if you have any questions, give us a call, and let us help you with Purview and figure out how exactly you'd like to deploy it and get it set up. Again, thank you for your time, and we look forward to seeing you on the next webinar. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.